This candle, we always light a candle to symbolize lighting up the darkness here at Accidental Talmudist. But I'd like to dedicate today's light to Yom HaZikaron, which is the day of remembrance in Israel. It's already nighttime there, so they've come to the next day, which we'll talk about in a minute. But for us, it's still daytime. And so I'd like to dedicate this candle and today's learning to all the soldiers who have fallen defending the state of Israel and victims of terror. So victims of terror and soldiers who have fallen defending Israel is whom we honor today on Yom HaZikaron. Israeli Day of Remembrance. Tonight, and like I said, it already began in Israel, they're 10 hours ahead of me, but tonight, measuring by our time, we begin Yom HaAtzmaut, and darkness is actually just starting to settle here in LA. So this is a good time to make a l'chaim. So this is a l'chaim for Yom HaAtzmaut, celebrating the miraculous establishment of the state of Israel. For 2,000 years, Jews have been longing with a desperate yearning and praying every day that Jews should be able to have their own land in the Holy Land. And in our lifetime, it happened. And the War of Independence in 1948, I mean, come on. If you don't believe in miracles, in fact, there's an old saying, who said it? He said, was it Ben Gurion? He said that in Israel, to be a realist, you must believe in miracles, right? And so to create a nation when there were 5 big armies ready to roll and attack Israel as soon as the British pulled out, it was a miracle that we survived that war, that Israel was created. And so today we say, happy 72nd birthday of Israel, and let us make a l'chaim for the state of Israel. We say the blessing, blessed be Lord our God, ruler of the universe, by whose word everything comes into being. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakol nehiyeh b'divaro. L'chaim. Happy birthday, Israel. Happy 72nd birthday. Okay. So, as I said at the beginning, we're dedicating today's learning. So in Israel, you always have that 1-2 punch. The somber and then the celebration. Yom HaZikaron, which began Monday night, and Yom HaAtzmaut, which began Tuesday night. So Yom HaZikaron, Israeli Remembrance Day for soldiers who fell defending the state and victims of terror. For them, we lit this candle and we dedicate today's learning on AT Daily. We are holding page 53, Daf 53, tractate Shabbos, the second tractate of the Talmud. We're now in chapter 5, and today we're going to be studying the second Mishnah of chapter 5. So, the Mishnah says that a donkey may go out on Shabbos, go out meaning leave the private domain and walk in the public domain, with a saddlecloth that was tied onto it before Shabbat began. And the purpose of the saddlecloth is to keep the donkey warm. So people, who own large animals know that keeping a donkey or a horse warm is very important for the health of the donkey. So you can have this saddlecloth tied onto the donkey. It has to be tied on before Shabbat began, and then you can leave it tied on the donkey so that it will stay warm. And it's because it's benefiting the donkey that the saddlecloth is not considered a burden to the donkey, right? We cannot place a burden on the donkey because just like we cannot work, are prohibited to work on Shabbos, likewise our animals are prohibited to work on Shabbos, right? Our service animals are prohibited to work on Shabbos. So we leave the blanket in place. And just like we were learning about yesterday, for controlling the animal, a bit in its mouth, if it's the right amount of control, if it's not excessive, that's a burden. And if it's not insufficient, because if you can't control the animal, then the piece that, that whatever bit you're trying to use, if it's not going to help you secure the donkey, then it is just a burden. And now we're learning that for the purposes of keeping the donkey warm, we can leave the saddlecloth on. However, if Shabbat came in and we didn't and the blanket wasn't already tied to the donkey, so now we can't tie the blanket onto the donkey on Shabbos. And why? Because tying on the saddlecloth, not a blanket, but a saddlecloth, right? So it's a specific object. It's not generally a blanket. It's the cloth that goes between the donkey and its saddle. Excuse me. So can we just lay the cloth on top of the donkey? Answer: if the donkey's going to remain in the courtyard of the home, meaning it's going to stay on private property, yes, we can put the blanket or the saddlecloth on top of the donkey to keep it warm. Why can't we tie it on? Because tying is too similar to the work of the donkey, right? When we tie the saddlecloth on, that's the same labor that we would do to then put the saddle on, right? And that is working the donkey. And so essentially the back, right, the spine of the donkey is muktzah. We can't do stuff on top of the donkey. We can't tie something onto the back of the donkey because that is considered burdening the donkey. We can put the cloth just on top of the donkey for its warmth. We just can't tie it on there. Now, if the saddlecloth is simply laying on the back of the donkey, that's fine in the private domain, but we can't now take the donkey out into the public domain. Why? Can you guess? Because the saddlecloth can fall off, right? If the saddlecloth falls off the donkey when we're out in the public domain, we can predict that the owner will pick it up. He doesn't want to lose the cloth. You're only allowed to put it on the donkey in the private domain, and you may well just forget and not think about it and pick up the cloth, which you don't want to lose because it's valuable, and then the owner will come to carry it more than 4 cubits in the public domain, and he would have violated the Shabbos prohibition on carrying. Okay, so now Rav Asi Bar Natan asked, may we place the saddlecloth on the animal and keep it in the private domain, right? Just to keep it warm in the private domain. Answer: yes. So, asks Rav Asi, may we use the saddle in the same way, right? We can't put a saddle on a donkey to ride the donkey because you can't burden the animal on Shabbos. You can't ride a donkey, you can't put a saddle on a donkey. But what if you're only using the saddle to keep the donkey warm? We know that you can't tie the saddle on because that's burdening the donkey, but can you just lay it on top of his back, knowing you're only going to keep it in the private domain just for the sake of keeping him warm? And the rabbis say, no. The saddle, a cloth, it's sort of like the minimum amount that you could put on top of the animal for the animal's sake, to keep it warm. But a saddle is just too much like work. A cloth is a cloth. It's like a blanket. You can imagine it has other uses on Shabbos. But a saddle is a muktzah item, right? It's a muktzah item. Now, it's not discussed here. I wonder if you designated it ahead of time and thought to yourself, well, I don't have a cloth. I need to keep the donkey warm. So if he gets really cold, I'm going to use the saddle just as a warming device and not as a saddle. I wonder if you could designate it that way. I'm not sure. But generally speaking, a donkey saddle is considered strongly muktzah, it has strong muktzah, and you can't touch it at all. You can't even move it because you need its place. If the saddle was left on top of the donkey And the question isn't, can we keep the donkey warm? The question is, can we relieve the donkey of its burden, right? The donkey's not supposed to be burdened. So for whatever reason, the saddle got left on top of the donkey. Can we remove the saddle from the donkey? Let me just do that. Do not disturb, sorry. Can we remove the saddle? Answer, yes, we can remove the saddle, but not by touching it, because we have an alternative. We don't need to touch the saddle in order to remove it from the donkey's back, right? So we're going to go out of our way to make sure that an animal isn't burdened, that an animal doesn't suffer, that an animal is not caused any undue, suffering, pain, burdening, nothing. We're very mindful of the welfare of animals. But we don't need to touch the saddle in order to remove it. What do? Once it's untied and it's just lying on top of the donkey, all we have to do is walk the donkey around the yard, kind of make a few sharp turns, and the saddle will fall off. And then you leave it wherever it lies, and you didn't need to touch it, right? So it's an important principle that we're gonna go out of our way to take the saddle off the donkey. But if there's a way to retain the muktzah status of the saddle and not violate touching a muktzah item by being a little bit creative, a little inventive, spending a little more energy to do it, then we will do that, right? We will do that. The saddle remains muktzah, and we didn't have to touch it in order to get it off the donkey's back. Rav said, when Rav was asked about placing the saddlecloth on top of the donkey's back, not the saddle, just the cloth now, which we said is permitted, but when they were figuring out whether the saddlecloth was permitted to be put on top of the donkey on Shabbos, right? You can't tie it onto the donkey on Shabbos, but keeping him in the private domain, you can place the saddlecloth on top of the donkey. When Rav was asked that question, he said, we may hang a basket of fodder, right? So like a feed bag, if you can imagine, maybe you've seen them on the horses in Central Park, right? Why do you put a feed bag on one of those carriage horses in Central Park in New York? Because the horse is, strapped into the wagon, right? So he's strapped into the wagon and he can't get down to the floor to reach the hay or something if there was fodder on the ground. So you attach the bag to the horse so that he can eat wherever he is and remain strapped in. Well, now what about on Shabbos? The horse is not going to be strapped to a wagon or a carriage. The horse is, presumably roaming free in the courtyard of the home. Rav says, just as we can place that feed bag on the horse, right? And why do you do that? It's really just for the pleasure of the horse, because now the horse is free. He can bend down to the ground. But we are permitted to place that bag of feed, hang it on the horse's head. That's not considered an unnecessary burden. It's for the pleasure of the animal that it can just reach the food easily. And if we can hang a bag of food around the horse's neck just for the pleasure of the horse, then by a kal vachomer, which means light and heavy, I'll explain one moment what that means, a kal vachomer. By the principle of kal vachomer, if we can hang a basket of food just for the pleasure of the animal, then how much more may we place a blanket on the animal's back where it's not just for the pleasure of the animal that he gets the food in an easy manner, but it's actually to protect the health and well-being of the animal, because if it gets cold, it can get sick and really have a big problem, right? So if in the minor case of just giving the animal a little bit of a break that has to bend down and for its own, sort of comfort, we can hang the bag of food on its neck, how much more when the animal has a critical need to stay warm, may we place the saddlecloth on its back? Rav's friend and disputant, Shmuel, said, well, if Rav said that, he doesn't understand the principles of Shabbos. Right? So he's a little bit of an exaggeration. Shmuel knows that Rav is one of the great sages in our history, but he's speaking a little bit emphatically. And what's he saying? What Shmuel was saying is that that you can put a saddlecloth on the donkey's back and it doesn't violate Shabbos. But the reason you could put the saddlecloth on the donkey's back is not the kal vachomer involving the feedbag, because the feedbag is prohibited. It is not permitted to put a feedbag to hang a feedbag on a horse's neck on Shabbos. So the kal vachomer is no good. So this kal vachomer, that is one of the 13 methods of learning out principles from Scripture that our sages used in creating the Mishnah and the Gemara. With the Mishnah and the Gemara together constitute the Talmud. So these are the hermeneutical principles. One is if something is permitted, right, in a case that is a little bit questionable, then something that is very related and less questionable will certainly be permitted. And that's why kal vachomer means light and heavy, right? Going from the light case to the heavy case, we can draw an analogy and we can learn that out. We today don't find kal vachomers in the Torah. This was a principle that was available to our sages back then when they were determining the oral law. Having said that, probably a dayan or a posek, people who have to make rulings of halacha today in novel situations, perhaps they would use the principle of a kal vachomer. But we're not going to invent, new kal vachomers that haven't been in place, where the situations that they might apply to have been in place for a long time. But the kal vachomer, sometimes translated as a fortiori sequence from the Latin, that's one of those Talmudic principles that we'll run into a lot, and that the sages use to derive a law in an unusual, in a new situation for them. So the question is now, why can't you hang a bag of food on the horse, right? Why can't you do that? The fodder bag is just so the horse doesn't have to bend down, and there's your answer. The horse can bend down, right? If the horse was attached to a cart, that's when it would need the fodder bag because it can't bend down. But now that it's roaming free in the courtyard, why shouldn't it bend down? Why did this kal vachomer exist at all? Because of the case of the foal, the young horse, right? Young horses sometimes have very long legs and short necks. And if the farmer looks at this young foal and says, you know what, this one is particularly fragile, and I'm afraid that it might hurt itself, maybe the ground is slippery, there's just not that much food, it's going to have to compete with its larger siblings or other full-grown horses. So just for the sake of the young foal, I'll give it its food in a feed bag hanger on its neck. Okay, in that case, you can hang the feed bag, but otherwise, no. Okay, so the general rule is that non-essential ornaments on an animal are prohibited, right? You can't put non-essential ornaments on an animal. If they are essential, well, they're not ornaments, right? An ornament is considered, a decoration. It's not essential to the well-being of the animal. But that brings us to the interesting case of the amulet. So in ancient times, and even not so ancient, I don't know if people have amulets today, probably in some cultures they still do. Certainly, in the 16, 17, 1800s, there were amulets. In fact, the founder of Hasidic Judaism, the Baal Shem Tov, was an amulet maker, right? And so what was an amulet? I mean, he would, he'd take some objects and put them in a little bag, and you would wear that around your neck, and it would have a medicinal effect, right? This is, when people had a different sort of practice of medicine than we have today, an amulet was considered a type of medical treatment, right? So then we ask, okay, well, if an animal is sick, if the goat or the horse is sick, shall we hang an amulet on it in order to treat it? Answer, if it's proven effective, right? Even then they knew that some amulets work and maybe most don't, or at least some don't, right? So an amulet would have to be proven to be effective. Why was it effective? Was it an aromatherapy type of thing? Was it some other way in which a medicine somehow penetrated? Was it more of a supernatural effect? Whatever the process was for that amulet to work, some amulets were proven to be effective, right? So somebody had a condition, they wore the amulet, and it worked. So a person can go out on Shabbos wearing an amulet, and an animal can go out on Shabbos wearing an amulet, but only if it's proven effective. And that raised the question, well, what about an amulet that was proven effective on a person? Now the horse is sick, can we take the person's amulet, the amulet that worked, that cured a person, can we now hang that amulet on the horse's neck? And the answer is no, because it hasn't been proven to be effective on the horse. Some people would say, well, wait a minute, the human is so much more complicated than the horse. If the amulet works to cure the human, surely it will work to cure the horse. And the answer from the sages is no, because humans obviously are different than horses. But in what way are they different? It's because the human, whenever the human is wearing an amulet for a medical purpose, in addition to the amulet itself, the human has mazal, right? So when we say mazal tov to people, we say mazel tov, right? Mazel tov, you're familiar with. What we're saying is you have good stars, right? Mazal refers to the stars or to the constellations, to the arrangement of the stars. And we're saying that when you have mazel tov, it means that the stars have aligned for you, and so good things are happening. God has arranged all the circumstances in your life so that a good thing is happening for you, and you have good mazal. But mazel or mazal, it has slightly different meanings. That's not the only meaning about the stars and the constellations. And in this context, mazal means that you have the seichel to understand, right, that the stars could align for you, that the amulet is working for you, right? So the human has what the horse doesn't. The human has the consciousness. And that's part of the medical healing of the amulet. And I think anybody who is a healer, and I see that Zipporah Bank has tuned in, who is a gifted healer, and I think Zipporah would tell you that part of anybody's healing is not just, what they eat and what they take, but that mental attitude that they bring to the healing process, including, praying to God for help, being grateful, being mindful, and doing other things that you need to do to keep that healing going. The animal lacks that. So even though the amulet might have worked for the person, it may or may not work on the animal who lacks the mazal, or that understanding of mazal that the human has. And this brings us to a digression. I really can't call it anything other than a digression. It doesn't really connect to what's going on in the Talmud at this point in our learning. But we do a fascinating digression. I guess you could tie it to mazal. You could tie it to somebody receiving the healing, as it were, the transformation that they need. So we have an incident. I'm going to read it to you. Okay. The sages taught, there was an incident where a man's wife died, and she left him a baby boy who needed to be nursed. And the man was so poor that he did not have the money to pay the wages of a wet nurse, right? To bring in a woman who, is lactating and could nurse the baby. A miracle was performed on his behalf, and he developed breasts like the two breasts of a woman, and he nursed his own son. Rav Yosef said, come and see how great this person is, that a miracle was performed on his behalf. Right? And now we're going to have 4 opinions. Rav Yosef is the first about how we're to interpret that this poor man, who has a baby son who needs to be nursed, and he can't afford to hire a wet nurse, and suddenly he has this miracle that he develops breasts and he's able to nurse his own son. Rav Yosef said this man must have been great, some kind of a tzaddik, right? Some kind of a righteous man, perhaps a saint, that such a incredible miracle was performed for him. And by the way, there are cases like this in the modern and the natural world. Not so much for humans, but some mammals, some male mammals, that this has been recorded in history that this happened. So Rav Yosef said, well, this man must have been great. Abaye, the sage Abaye, says, what are you talking about, great man? This is a humiliation and an embarrassment for him. He doesn't want to have breasts. The natural order didn't have to be upended. How embarrassing it must be for him that the natural order was upended. And the result of the miracle was just, so that he could nurse a baby. Surely there's some other solution to feed that baby than to upend everything and perhaps use up this man's supply of miracles on this particular incident. Right? So here we already have this kind of understanding. Miracles happen. Miracles happen. I like to talk about miracles because I've experienced a few little miracles myself, as sort of, God tipping his hand a little bit. Right? God is the greatest magician of all time. He made the entire universe, runs it constantly, showers us with love and nourishment and everything we need, and yet he's the all-time champ at playing hide and seek. Most of the world doesn't even believe God exists, certainly acts like God doesn't exist, and he not only created everything from scratch, but he runs everything, gives to us constantly, and never reveals himself, right? God is totally in hiding all the time in our world. But because God loves us so much, now and then, here and there, he tips his hand, right? And so these are like the little miracles. They're only miracles if you view them as miracles. If you're going to be a skeptic, you're going to say, oh, what's the big deal? Things happen. Nature happens. Random things happen. Weird things happen. They happen all the time. They're just weird, right? But they're not. They're gifts from God. So Abai is saying, yes, of course, we get gifts from God. And every person will have a certain number of miracles in their life. And we don't want to use them up on a strange situation like this, and where the guy ends up walking around with the breasts of a woman while his baby is nursing. Abaye would prefer not to have such a miracle be performed for him. If he's going to get a miracle, let that miracle end up in a bag of gold. He could end up building a school, and educating hundreds of students, or create a hospital, right? Or do something that benefits many, 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 many more people. That's what Abaye is thinking, right? It's not that he would selfishly want a miracle so he could get rich, but he would want a miracle to occur that would result in assistance for the many, and not just this weird event for the one. That's Abaye's opinion. Rav Yehuda comments on this incident. How great is Parnasa? Parnasa is livelihood, right? He says, how great and how difficult is it to create a livelihood for a person? Because here, right, the Almighty looked down into this situation with this man who didn't have enough money to hire a wet nurse for his baby, and created a miracle for him that he should have breasts. Was it easier to give this man a miracle that gave him lactating breasts? Was that actually easier than just, giving him a job that makes enough money so he could hire the wet nurse? Apparently. And so, what Rav Yehuda is saying is, never take a situation for granted in which you're making a living. Right? Right? If you're making a living, if you're getting by, if you have a home and if you have a shelter and clothing and food and the things that you need, if you have a family and you're providing for your family, that is no small thing. You know, if you find yourself just complaining about how much you hate your job and not having any gratitude for the fact that you that you have a livelihood, then take a step back and realize how lucky you are. And I'll tell you something, this teaching would have been relevant at any time in any place. But now that we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic and so many people have suddenly and seemingly out of nowhere had their livelihood ripped away from them. You know, if you haven't had your livelihood ripped away from you, if you're so blessed, first of all, thank God. And second, have compassion, right? Have compassion on all the people who have lost their livelihood, because a livelihood is a great and precious thing. It's a precious thing and never something to take for granted. And then the final comment on this incident comes from Rav Nachman. And he says, similar to Rav Yehuda, he says, miracles are often performed. Miracles happen, right? So similar to Abaye, miracles happen. Sure, miracles happen. Of course, miracles happen. And yet, it has never happened, right? Never, says Rav Nachman, that when miracles happen all the time in the world, but it never happened that the miracle that was created for a person was that his refrigerator was filled with food. Why? Right? Miracles happen. A man might buy the first book of the Talmud on day one of a 7.5-year cycle. A person, God forbid, might end up in a ventilator, in an ICU, and be within a hair of death. And then he heals. Maybe there's a community praying for him, and the doctor said, that's it, this guy's gonna die, it's over. And then somehow he comes back to life. A person's in a car accident, they're clinically dead. They're not just gonna die, they're dead. And then they come back to life on the operating table. Miracles happen in this world. And yet the nature of those miracles is never to fill the refrigerator with food, never to fill the pantry with food, says Rav Nachman, right? Why? Because that's something that God said we would have to do for ourselves, right? That goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. By the sweat of your brow will you earn your bread. So getting food, that's left to us. That's not a miracle that's going to happen, right? So when we talk about, having a livelihood, making sure that we're secure and safe in this world, I mean, that is something that's got to be taken with dead earnest seriousness, right? And I've heard people talk, I won't say who, but recently I had a conversation with somebody who's of a retired age right now. And he commented to me, he said, Sal, I see what you do, and that you teach every day, and that you love it. And, and you work for the nonprofit that allows this to happen. And so you're able to make a living doing what you love. And you should feel so blessed. Because the person that I was talking to, he's retired now, and he spent 40, working at a job that he hated. And he said, that's what we did. That was my generation. We didn't expect to enjoy our work. We did it because we had to provide. I don't feel like, I made any kind of a bigger sacrifice than other people. I just did what I did. That's what we do. But this person who's telling me that story, appreciate, even though he didn't like the job, but he appreciated the opportunity, and he always did his best, and his employers were always grateful to have him there because he never took that job for granted. He didn't like it, but he didn't take it for granted, and he did his best, right? And so that kind of attitude, maybe it's a little old-fashioned. Maybe we don't see that so much anymore, where everybody wants to have, meaning out of their work. And they should. They absolutely should. But in seeking meaning, we must never overlook the fact that we have to provide, right? And when we're able to provide, it's not a miracle. It's greater than a miracle. Right? When we have a parnasa, regular parnasa, it's greater than a miracle. And it's something that we have to be thankful for the opportunity and thankful to our employer or thankful to our clients, whoever it is that makes it possible. And of course, most of all, thankful to the Holy One above who has arranged for us to have that parnasa. All right. That's what I've got for us today. Let me just look at the comments a little bit. Melissa Itel-Jurin says, where there's life, there's hope. Amen. Absolutely right. Zipporah is saying they didn't give babies cow milk. That's right. Very good, Zipporah. That wasn't even, Zipporah does not like people to eat dairy. That's a discussion for another day. But it is interesting that in this story in the Talmud, no one suggested that this guy give the baby, cow milk or goat milk, right? The baby needed human milk, and the miracle was performed that the father could do it directly rather than hire a wet nurse. But somehow no one suggested that the baby eat goat milk or cow milk. Good point. Very nice, very nice. All right, I'm not seeing other questions. No, so that's what I've got for us today. Today's learning has been dedicated to all of the fallen soldiers and victims of terror that we recall for Yom HaZikaron, which is just ending now in Israel. And we started with a l'chaim, and we'll just finish that l'chaim wishing Israel a very happy 72nd birthday on Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, l'chaim. All the best, my holy brothers and sisters.